When I first moved into the lakeside neighborhood, I didn't think much about the HOA beyond the usual stories you hear. A bunch of people nitpicking about lawn length, paint color, or whether your trash cans were visible from the street. And I figured I'd play along just enough to keep the peace, because all I really wanted was quiet mornings on my porch, fishing afternoons by the water, and evenings where the crickets drowned out the noise of the world. Realized this wasn't your average HOA. It was a full-blown dictatorship ruled by a woman who seemed to think she owned every inch of property within 3 miles. Karen, the president of the association, who walked around with a clipboard in one hand, a smartphone in the other, and an expression like everyone else's existence was a personal inconvenience to her. And while I tolerated her first few visits, complaining about where I stack, though it predated the HOA, I drew the line when she started making demands about my lake access, telling me I couldn't swim, boat, or even fish without registering with her committee and paying some absurd fee. And that was when I pulled out my deed, laid it flat on the hood of her shiny SUV, and showed her, clear as day, that my property wasn't subject to her HOA's rules at all, because my land had been bought years before the association, uncontested, untouchable, mine, which she didn't like one bit. And from that day forward, I had a target on my back, every week bringing some new petty letter, some fine I wasn't obligated to pay, some threat about how she'd make me comply one way or another. And while most neighbors either feared her or grudgingly went along, I wasn't about to bend, because my father raised me to stand firm when you know you're right. And the truth was on my eye. And the truth was on my eye. Harassment. I made a decision. I was going to formally withdraw from any pretense of membership, cut ties with the HOA altogether, and live free of their nonsense, which I was perfectly entitled to do under the law. And I thought maybe, just maybe, that would be the end of it. But of course, Karen doesn't take no for an answer, and the day I delivered my withdrawal letter, stamped and notarized, she stormed up my driveway like she owned the rise. She stormed up my driveway like she owned the. I was bound for life, waving her clipboard like it was a weapon, and when I calmly told her she was trespassing and needed to leave, she did the most predictable thing imaginable. She pulled out her phone, called the cops, and told them I was a hostile homeowner, refusing to follow HOA rules, and I'll never forget the smirk on her face as she whispered into the receiver, like she thought she had finally cornered me. Like this was the chat. Didn't know. And what she was about to learn the hard way was that my son wasn't just visiting me that week. He wasn't just a family member lending moral support. He was a fully sworn officer of the law with a badge in his pocket, a body cam on his chest, and the authority to do what no one else had dared to. Hold Karen accountable for the very laws she had broken for years while hiding behind her HOA title. And by the time those HOA title, and by the time those CE fell the HOA title, and by the time those also was about to come crashing down in a way she never saw coming. When the squad car rolled up to the curb, lights washing the cul-de-sac in red and blue, I half expected the responding officer to step out, take one look at Karen with her theatrics, and immediately side with her just to avoid paperwork, because that's the way it usually went in neighborhoods like this where the HOA pretended to be the law of the land. But what Karen didn't realize, and what made me almost laugh out loud as I leaned back against on my porch the entire time, sipping coffee, watching her melt down with quiet amusement, and when the officer walked over, Ethan stood, slid his jacket back just enough to flash his badge, and said, "It's all right, officer, I've got this." And the change in tone was instant, like someone flipped a switch, because suddenly the authority shifted from Karen with her fake clipboard power to my son with the real weight of the state behind him. And Kara, wait, what? You can't just flash a badge at me. You're not even. But Ethan cut her off calmly, explaining that he was indeed an officer, that he had every right to intervene in a situation involving false claims and harassment, and that her call to 911 accusing me of being a hostile threat was not only baseless but could itself qualify as filing a false police report, which carried consequences far greater than the little fine she, now realizing who Ethan was, asked if he wanted to take lead on the matter, which he did. And suddenly Karen, who had marched up my driveway with all the smug confidence of a queen about to banish a peasant, was standing there like a child caught stealing candy, her bluster faltering as Ethan began questioning her. Why had she trespassed onto private property? Why had she insisted I was part of her HOA despite clear documentation proving otherwise? Why had she made a knowingly false report to emergency services? And as each question landed, her answers grew weaker. Because everyone else has to. Or, you can't just ignore community rules. Or, I was only protecting the neighborhood. Until even the responding officer gave her a look like, "Lady, you've officially lost it." And I swear I could see the moment her brain finally processed the trap she'd walked into, because she tried to backpedal, insisting it was just a misunderstanding, that she didn't mean to waste police resources, that she thought maybe I was being aggressive and needed intervention. But Ethan didn't let up, calmly reminding her that her actions weren't criminal, especially when combined with the repeated pattern of harassment, intimidation, and the HOA's financial misconduct he'd started investigating after hearing my complaints. Because what she didn't know was that Ethan had already pulled property records, bank statements, and even 911 call histories from this neighborhood as part of a quiet inquiry. And her little stunt today had given him the perfect opportunity to tote AU. That she would be detained for questioning regarding misuse of emergency services, she completely lost control, shrieking that she was the law here and that no outsider cop was going to tell her what to do on her own street, which was the exact moment Ethan calmly stepped forward, recited her rights, and placed her in handcuffs right there in front of the neighbors who had gathered at the edges of their driveways, whispering and pointing. Hoping for the day someone finally stood up to the tyrant who had made their lives miserable, and as Karen screamed and kicked, demanding to be released, my son led her toward the patrol car, every step stripping away the illusion of control she had clung to for so long, while I just stood there, arms crossed, finally feeling like justice wasn't some abstract idea, but something tangible, happening right in front of me. And as the neighbors murdered, I realized this was only the beginning, because while Karen was being hauled off, Ethan leaned back and told me in a low voice that he intended to dig deeper to expose every shady deal and illegal move her HOA had made over the years, and that by the time he was done, she wouldn't just lose her clipboard and title. She'd lose everything she had ever used to bully people with. The neighborhood felt strangely quiet in the days that followed Karen's arrest, as if the air itself had shifted now that her shrill demands and constant patrols had vanished. But beneath that silence ran an undercurrent of tension because the HOA board, stripped of its figurehead, scrambled to cover the gaps she'd left, though none of them had her particular brand of shameless aggression. And while they tried to project authority with sternly were difficult times. The truth was, Ethan had already started pulling threads that would unravel the entire organization, and he wasn't doing it alone. He brought in a small team from his department's financial crimes division, quiet professionals who knew how to follow money trails through shell accounts, forged receipts, and maintenance fees that never actually funded maintenance. And when I asked him just how bad he thought it was, he smirked. And just how bad he thought it was, he smirked. And how did he pee it? And smirked, and just how bad he thought it was, he smirked, and Banichwana put one in handcuffs, which made me wonder just how deep Karen's influence went. Because sure enough, within a week, Ethan uncovered that the HOA board had been inflating dues for years, funneling excess cash into side accounts under the names of relatives, paying themselves stipends disguised as landscaping or security expenses, and even using funds to pay off personal debts. And while the neighbors had long suspected something shady was going on, the liens, fines, and foreclosure to challenge it. But once Ethan started sharing evidence with the community, real documents, bank records, signed checks with board members' names, people's fears shifted into fury because they realized they'd been robbed not just of money, but of peace of mind. And the anger grew into momentum. When Ethan arranged a community meeting at my property, a gathering Karen could no longer disrupt, where he laid out documents on a screen for everyone to see, walking them through each scheme, and the gasps and murmurs that rose from the crowd made it clear that this was the first time many of them truly understood the scale of what had been done to them, because it wasn't just Karen being cruel, it was a calculated system of theft, intimidation, and exploitation. And Ethan explained how the law viewed those actions, how filing fraudulent liens or punishable by fines, restitution, and even prison time. And by the end of the night, the neighbors weren't just angry, They were united, rallying around Ethan's call to action, signing petitions, drafting affidavits, and offering their own evidence of years of harassment, from bogus fines to threats of property seizure. And as all of this gathered into a storm, Karen herself sat in county lockup awaiting arraignment, completely unaware of the unaware of the assured me she'd learned soon enough because the prosecutors were eager to make an example out of her. And when news stations caught wind of the story, an HOA president arrested by an officer who just happened to be the homeowner's son, they descended on the community, cameras rolling, eager to broadcast the downfall of a woman who had once relished calling the cops on her neighbors for the smallest of infractions, and suddenly the HOA wasn't fee. Spotlight? And I watched from my porch as news vans drove by, reporters speaking into microphones about systematic abuse of power in local homeowners associations, and the neighbors, emboldened by the exposure, no longer whispered but openly celebrated, dropping their trash cans by the curb without worrying about their placement, repainting shutters in colors Karen once banned, and even holding block parties in defiance of the old noise, And each passing day, Ethan brought me new updates, subpoenas issued, accounts frozen, board members questioned. And though the process would take time, the outcome was already clear. The HOA's reign was ending, and Karen's empire, built on lies and fear, was collapsing faster than she could scream from her cell. And as I sat with Ethan one evening, sipping coffee while neighbors stopped by to thank him, I couldn't help but ask, do you think this will stick? That will stick. That mean help but ask. Do you think this will stick? That vote DMI. And he nodded with the kind of certainty only someone who had seen justice done could have, saying, Dad, they picked the wrong family to mess with, and they're about to find out just how wrong they were. The courthouse was packed on the morning of Karen's arraignment, neighbors filling the gallery with a kind of electric anticipation that felt less like solemn justice and more like the climax of a long overdue reckoning, because for years they had endured her insults, fines, and constant threats. But now she was the one in handcuffs, her wrist locked tight in steel as deputies escorted her past flashing cameras and a sea of reporters shouting question. Usual smug expression. Her eyes darted nervously when she spotted Ethan standing tall near the prosecutor's table, his badge gleaming in plain sight as if to remind her of the one fact she couldn't twist, couldn't argue away, that the very cop she had once summoned to harass her neighbors was the same man who had dismantled her empire brick by brick. And when the judge read the list of charges, fraud, embezzlement, harassment, filing fall, gallery turned into murmurs of satisfaction, with one neighbor even whispering, finally, loud enough that Karen whipped her head around in fury, though she quickly realized she had no power here, no clipboard, no phony violation slips, just cold hard facts stacked against her. And when the prosecution presented Ethan's evidence, a slideshow of bank transfers, falsified invoices, and sworn affidavits from dozens of residents, seat to shout, this is all lies. I built this community. Without me, it would be chaos. Before the judge slammed the gavel and ordered her to sit. But instead of silencing the room, her outburst only deepened the disgust of those watching, because they weren't fooled anymore. They saw her for what she was, a bully who had stolen from them while demanding gratitude, a dictator brought low by her own arrogance. And as the testimony continued, the cracks in her defenses widened, her lawyer fumbling to explain turned out to be checks to her cousin or security fees that were direct payments to her personal credit card. And with every revelation, the neighbors leaned forward, eyes fixed on the woman who had once relished fining them for things as petty as lawn height. And now the irony was thick. Karen facing thousands of dollars in her own fines, only this time they came from the justice system, not from her clipboard. And when it came time for Rue, Ethan and at me in the gallery, shouting that we had orchestrated this, that the community had turned into ungrateful traitors. But the judge cut her off again, warning that further outbursts would hold her in contempt. And still she couldn't stop, because losing control was Karen's greatest fear, and here she was drowning in it, her voice cracking, her words collapsing into sobs as deputies finally had to escort her from the room. Downfall, footage that aired on the evening news across the state, the once untouchable HOA president reduced to a ranting spectacle in shackles, and when we left the courthouse, reporters swarmed Ethan, asking him about the case, about how it felt to arrest the same woman who had called the police on his father, and Ethan, steady as ever, said, "Justice doesn't play favorites. The law is the law. Everyone is accountable." Words that echoed through every TV and radio broadcast that week, while neighbors who had once lived in fear now walked the streets with pride, finally free of the grip Karen had held over them. And though the legal process would take months, with trials and sentencing still ahead, everyone already knew the verdict, not just of the court, but of the community, and for Karen, the gavel had already fallen, because her wreck, the lake neighborhood she once controlled, was finally breathing easy for the first time in years. The sound of laughter and kids playing, replacing the constant echo of her threats. And as Ethan told me that night over dinner, she thought she could write the rules for everyone else. Turns out the real rules were waiting for her in court. The sentencing day felt more like a festival than a grim court proceeding, because the neighbors gathered in groups outside the courthouse, holding coffee cups and chatting like they were finally free of a long nightmare. And though the subject of their joy was the ruin of one woman, it wasn't cruelty, it was relief, a collective exhale after years of being suffocated under Karen's tyrannical HOA reign. And when the bailiffs escorted her in, chains rata, jumpsuit, the hush that fell over the room was profound, because here was the woman who once strutted with a clipboard and a smug smirk, reduced to nothing more than a defendant awaiting judgment, her eyes darting nervously as she tried to find anyone in the crowd willing to meet her gaze. But nobody did, not even the handful of former board members who had once supported her, because they too had turned against her when Ethan's evidence fee. The judge entered and everyone rose. You could feel the weight of finality pressing down on the chamber. This was the moment that would decide whether Karen walked away with a slap on the wrist, or whether she paid in full for years of corruption, fraud, harassment, and cruelty. And the prosecutor wasted no time reminding the court of every victim, recounting the seniors who had nearly lost their homes to fraudulent liens, the young couple Karen had truanted, the veterans whose service flags she had declared unapproved decorations, and even the children she had chastised for riding bikes on sidewalks, because her reign of control had left scars across every family in that neighborhood. And while she sat there fidgeting with her shackled hands, the defense tried to paint her as a misunderstood woman who only wanted order. But the judge was not fooled, his words sharp as he reminded the court. Community leadership requires trust, and that Karen had systematically betrayed that trust, exploiting it for personal gain. And then came the sentence, a string of numbers that crashed over Karen like a tidal wave: 7 years in state prison for fraud and embezzlement, restitution of hundreds of thousands of dollars to the community members she had stolen from, a permanent ban from holding any HOA or public office, and the collective gasp of the room turned into cheers, because justice had not just been spoken, it had been enforced. And Karen's knees buckled as deputies dragged her out. Her final words a hissed, "This isn't over," that no one believed, because it was. It was truly over. And from that day forward, the Lake neighborhood began to rebuild, not with fear and threats, but with cooperation and shared ownership. Neighbors stepping up to form a volunteer instead of punishments, like renovating the playground, organizing lake cleanups, and hosting block parties. And through it all, Ethan and I stood at the center, not as rulers, but as facilitators, making sure the systems were transparent, fair, and community-driven. And for the first time in decades, people laughed when they walked their dogs, waved to each other without suspicion, and actually felt at home in their own homes, because Karen's shadow in their own homes, because Karen's shadow, community spirit. And one summer evening, as I watched the sunset glimmer across the lake, neighbors setting up chairs for a cookout, kids splashing in the water without fear of being fined, Ethan sat down beside me and said quietly, "You know, this could have gone the other way if we didn't stand up when we did." And I nodded, realizing he was right, because Karen had counted on silence, on compliance. But once the truth came out, once we were fists came out, once we were fists, fake communal as compliance. Illusion collapsed, and as the sound of laughter echoed across the lake, I couldn't help but think that sometimes justice isn't just about punishment, it's about freedom, about giving people their lives back. And that was exactly what had been won the day HOA Karen finally lost everything.